Hey guys, so I was working on my chocolate videos for the upcoming weeks, and I realized I was talking about something that maybe people don't know about. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about something called the Harkin Engel Protocol, sometimes called the Cocoa Protocol. What does this have to do with chocolate? It's basically an agreement about the worst forms of child slave labor in Western Africa. So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. This is going to be, it's a really complicated issue, and there's a lot of information behind it, and I can really only glance, although this is probably going to be a 20-minute video, I can really only skirt the top of the issue and give you an overview because it's really complicated, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't get done. So, forgive me if I'm reading lots of notes today because I will be. So let's start. This is the Harkin Engel Protocol. It was signed in September of 2001. So what's the background here? So, 2000, BBC comes out with a documentary called Slavery, A Global Investigation. It talked about slavery, obviously, but one of the parts that it focused on was using children as slave labor in cocoa production in Western Africa. And then there was subsequent media coverage about this topic, and it just became known. It came to the forefront. There was a lot of pushback at the time from the ambassadors of the country involved. They disputed the numbers. There was pushback from the European Cocoa Association. They said that it was false and excessive. But some politicians in the United States decided to get involved. And they were first Elliot Engel. He was in the House of Representatives. He was actually from 1989 to just this past year when he lost in the primary. Representing New York, he was in the House of Congress. What else do I want to tell you about him? He's interested in human rights. He was a member of the Congressional Human Rights Caucus. When this came up, he decided he wanted to do something. So what he did was actually, let me just check my notes here. So in 2001, he introduced a legislative amendment to an agricultural bill that would give the FDA $250,000 to create a certification system, a labeling system, so that people would know that the chocolate that they were buying was not produced with child slave labor. So $250,000, it's something similar, kind of like fair trade, more like dolphin safe tuna, that kind of label. Not to really say that children and dolphins are the same, but that kind of labeling system. So it passed in the House of Representatives. Then it went to the Senate. And when it got to the Senate, it got some serious pushback from the cocoa industry. Lots of lobbyists got involved. The Cocoa Manufacturers Association hired former Senators George Mitchell and Bob Dole to lobby against it for the cocoa industry. They were afraid of boycotting. They were afraid of losing profits. They were lobbying basically for child slave labor, which is terrible. So what Mitchell and Dole encouraged the industry to do was to come to an agreement with the Senator Harkin got involved when it went to the Senate, and Representative Engel, to come to an agreement with the industry so that it wouldn't have to be legislated, basically. So they created the Harkin Engel Protocol. It was signed in 2001, and the main objective was to eliminate what they call the worst forms of child labor, which is not all child labor, not all slave labor, just the worst forms of child labor. It was signed by a lot of people. So I have a copy here. It's signed by the Chocolate Manufacturers Association, the World Cocoa Association. It's signed by Senator Harkin, Congressman Engel, the Ambassador of Ivory Coast. Let's see. Who else signed it? The Executive Director of Free the Slaves, the Director of the International Labor Organization, National Consumer League, Child Labor Organization, and then you have it signed by several chocolate manufacturers that you can see here. So you have Gary Guittard, you have the Guittard Company, you have World's Finest Chocolate, Nestle, Hershey, Mars, Archer Daniels Midland, which is a processor of one of the larger processors. I think they've now been absorbed by another company. Bloomer Chocolate and Barry Callebaut. So big names in there. Nestle, Mars, Hershey. So the big guns in the chocolate industry. So they signed this agreement. The official name of the agreement was, deep breath, Protocol for the Growing and Processing of Cocoa Beans and Their Derivative Products in a Manner that Complies with ILO Convention 182 concerning the prohibition and immediate action for the elimination of the worst forms of child labor. That is the full name of the Harkin Engel Protocol. Okay, so they had basically 6 objectives. Now this was a non-binding agreement. The industry was going to regulate itself and there were no legal ramifications involved. So here are the 6 things that they agreed to address the worst forms of child labor in the cocoa industry. One was a public statement of the need for and terms of the action plan. So the cocoa industry actually had to acknowledge that there was a problem with forced child labor and they were going to commit to solving the problem. Number 2, a formation of multi-sectoral advisory groups. Now this protocol also had deadline dates on it. So this was supposed to be done by October 2001. An advisory group will be formed, and by December 2001, they will come up with remedies and formulas to address the worst forms of child labor. Number 3, a signed joint statement witnessed by the ILO, the International Labor Organization, recognizing the need to end the worst forms of child labor and develop alternatives for removing the children from labor. So you can't just pull the kids out and plunk them wherever in Africa. You have to do some remediation. You have to educate them. You have to remove them from that lifestyle and kind of reprogram them and educate them and give them training in a vocation that they can sustain themselves in. So that was to be done by December 2001. Number 4, a memorandum of cooperation. This was to be established by May 2002. So this was a joint action of research, information exchange, and action to enforce standards to eliminate child slave labor. Number 5, a joint foundation. The foundation was to be by July 2002 to oversee efforts to eliminate the worst forms of labor. So it would promote field projects and act as a clearinghouse for best practices. And the last one, the industry would develop and implement industry-wide standards of public certification that cocoa had been grown without any of the worst forms of child labor. So this was supposed to be done by July 2005. Wrapped up, certification, ready to go. Like I said, this was a non-binding agreement. The industry was going to regulate itself. And there was really no legal recourse for no legal action if they did not self-regulate themselves. So let's do some checkups here. So July 2005 was when everything was supposed to be done and completed. By July 2005, here's what they had done. They had acknowledged the problem. They had created the International Cocoa Initiative, which has a website. You can go look that up. And they spent $3 million on pilot projects. $3 million may sound like a lot to you and me, but it is a drop in the bucket to the cocoa industry. They are over $100 billion industry. $3 million is nothing. So they also assigned the International Institute of Tropical Agriculture to survey West Africans to find out exactly how much child slavery was going on, and they started some pilot projects for verification. What they still had not done at the end of July 2005, there was no industry-wide certification standard. They were executing at this whole process at the smallest possible cost to them, and they were still maintaining their business model that was based on child labor. They were not paying farmers more. They had not changed the price of cocoa to the farmers, to the consumer. Nothing changed. There were some other factors that come into this. So there's a lot of political factors that come into this as well with the West African area. So Ivory Coast has had several civil wars in the last 20 years. One of them was from the first civil war was 2002 to 2004. That impacted the ability of, or so they say, them to get on the ground to see what was happening. The second one was from 2011, 2012, but we're not there yet. We're still in 2005. So cocoa and diamonds and timber were actually part of what you'd call a conflict resource during these wars. So militants made money from selling the cocoa to these large multinational industries. So even at this time, the extent of child labor was unclear because they couldn't get in there. They were only doing minimal efforts. They made a joint effort to extend it by 3 more years. So Congress was not happy with this. They sent the U.S. Labor Department $4.3 million to contract someone to be their overseer. And that contract in 2006 went to the Payson Center for International Development at Tulane University. They had that contract through 2009. And they put out a report in 2007, which you can get online if you are interested. It's a very long report, first annual report put out in 2007. 271 pages long. It's a doozy. But they said there was some progress, but children were still working in cocoa production, including dangerous tasks. They regularly missed school. There was no certification. And the governments in Ivory Coast and Ghana were criticized for their lack of transparency. Also, there's quite a bit of corruption built into African governments sometimes. So I just want to read to you from the report some of the things that children were recorded doing. So I'll read the ones that, this is 5 to 12-year-olds were doing this. 90% of the time they were gathering and heaping cocoa. 20% they were plucking cocoa pods. 35% were breaking cocoa pods in fermentation. 50% were carting fermented cocoa beans. That's heavy labor. 29% were drying the cocoa beans. 21% were carting the cocoa beans to the shed. Carrying water for spraying, 62%. 51% were weeding. 18% were sowing and staking. There's just 3% were applying fungicides and herbicides. So there's a lot of lifting heavy loads, using sharp objects, machetes to open the pods, things that 5-year-old kids really shouldn't be doing, and they should be in school instead. So the government put Tulane University in charge of being the overseer because obviously the cocoa industry was not self-regulating very well. When the deadline had passed in 2005, the International Labor Rights Fund filed a lawsuit against Nestle, Cargill, and Archer Daniel Midlands on behalf of three kids from Mali who were child slave laborers. But the case was dismissed because the judge said that the companies could not be held liable for violations of international law. I don't really understand the law behind that. That doesn't make sense to me, but there's some legal thing going on. So let's go 3 years ahead from when our next deadline is. So the next deadline is June 1st, 2008. The things that they had done: 10 million into the International Cocoa Initiative, also drop in the bucket. They had done several training sessions with the Ivory Coast and Ghana government to sensitize police, media, officials to the worst forms of child labor. They had only collected data on 50% of the growing areas in the two countries, Ivory Coast and Ghana, that they were concentrating on. So the objectives had still not been met. They extended again. Let's extend it to 2010. So they said, let's extend it again. By 2010, we'll have certification and independent verification. In 2009, the U.S. State Department put Ivory Coast and Ghana on their Tier 2 watch list for human trafficking, due in part to children in cocoa production. So the Payson Center at Tulane was again contracted to act as the overseer. So we were extended to 2010. Let's come to 2010. 2010, a joint declaration is issued. They reaffirmed their commitment to working to eliminate the worst forms of child labor, which they've basically done very little successfully up to this point. And they reframed the idea, instead of eliminating, to reduce the worst forms of child labor by 70% by 2020, another 10 years. So they said they wanted to promote sustainable livelihoods for cocoa farmers. Poverty is definitely wrapped up in this issue. They wanted to establish community-based monitoring, and they wanted to continue national child labor surveys. So they have to know, the surveys are there, they have to know if the kids are in slave labor, how much slave labor is happening, so they know what to do. Poverty is a big part of this, as is war, because a lot of the kids come from neighboring countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, where the poverty is incredibly terrible. It's really, really hard life in those two countries. And men come and they recruit children and they tell the parents, oh yeah, we're going to give your kids a job and an education and take them to these cocoa farms, and they'll learn how to be cocoa farmers. Except when they get there, that's not the reality. The parents think they're sending these kids to do these great things and get paid, but in reality, what they're doing is, and they don't know this when they're sending them off, is that they're sending them to be slave labor on cocoa farms. So in 2010, there was a little bit of a transfer of responsibility more onto the governments of Ivory Coast and Ghana. So the 2010 declaration said that Ivory Coast and Ghana must conduct a survey of child labor, provide remediation for the worst forms of child labor. So not just pulling them out, but giving them something else to do, giving them an education, helping them recover from slave labor. 3, prevent the worst forms of child labor, enforce the laws, that's always helpful, and to develop infrastructure for cocoa regions. The industry must support a child labor survey, support remediation, provide sustainable livelihoods to the cocoa farmers, and ensure safe practices in the cocoa supply chain. So the industry committed $7 million over 5 years. Woo! That really hurt them, I bet. $7 million over 5 years, $3 million committed for remediation. The U.S. Department of Labor is now involved in giving more money. They give $10 million to support the framework. I'm not exactly sure what that means, but they're involved. The U.S. Department of Labor is giving more than the $100 billion industry. Does that make sense? Not to me. Anyway. All right, let's jump ahead another year, 2011. There's 1.8 million kids working in the cocoa agriculture. 5% in Ivory Coast, 10% in Ghana are working for pay. The rest are in slave labor conditions. Between 2001 and 2009, several thousand children were remediated, which means withdrawal, rehabilitation, reinsertion into society, education, and vocational training. And still in 2011, we have no certification and no independent verification happening. So this is 6 years after the whole thing was supposed to be wrapped up in a nice, pretty package. In 2018, the Cocoa Barometer report, which you can also get online, reported that, and I'm going to have to read this, not a single company or government is anywhere near reaching the sector-wide objective of the elimination of child labor, and not even near their commitments of a 70% reduction in child labor by 2020. So it's 2020, and there's nothing. You can go look at your chocolate bars. You can see what's happening on your chocolate bars. There's no guarantee of slave-free labor. There's no guarantee on any of the major players on their chocolate. This protocol focused on West Africa because that is where the media was focused on. That's not to say that this doesn't happen in other areas. It's not to say that other areas are not addressing this, but that's just where this protocol focused on. This is one of the things about craft chocolate that is good. In a lot of cases, you can tell where your cocoa is coming from. There's a lot of transparency in some cases, like Taza has a lot of transparency, Uncommon Cacao has a lot of transparency. So there's a lot of transparency where they are paying the farmers a fair price. This really ties a lot of it back into the level of poverty that cocoa farmers are living at. They are working as hard as anybody and making daily wages below the, often much below the world poverty standard. So changes still have to be made. Why am I telling you about this? Because next week I'm going to talk about a chocolate bar who is purposefully working as an impact company towards the goal of ending slavery in the chocolate industry. So I hope you will join me then to learn about how your money and your dollars can make a difference in helping the world be a better place. So I hope you'll come next week and find out what chocolate company I may be talking about. Thanks for watching.